Hello guys, and glad to have you on board again today. Number 2 on our series about psychological videos, because as we worked around uncertainty and impatience biases back then, should be a little while ago right now, we are going to work on another set of biases. There are going to be trend biases. They're actually just one, but the problem in here is that instead of having a single solution for everyone, just like we had on those impatience and uncertainty biases, we're going to have multiple solutions in here depending on your psychological person. So it depends on your identity, basically, and I'm going to explain why and all of those things. So today is a preparation structure. This series of videos is divided by 2, and we're going to get on the first kind of an introduction of all the background processes, neuronal and hormonal processes at play in this pattern. And the thing is, in a second stage, we're going to explain how identity per identity levels, how do you actually work around these biases. So yeah, today is going to be a little bit complicated, of course. I hope you followed on the previous one when we talked about the neurobiology of those biases and stuff like that, because today we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this. Last time we talked about our brain. Today we're going to get into the hormonal system. Kind of an introduction though, because this is not the last time we're going to talk about biases. If you keep on pushing this coaching series down to expert levels, there is going to be another bias that emerged later on, and this one goes right down to hormonal system in its whole. So today is kind of a mix in between. We're just getting started with the hormonal system, caring about the most important things in this. You're probably already familiar with that. We're going to talk about cortisol today, but I'm going to explain everything about it, what actually happens neurologically and biologically speaking into your mind and body, and how these things can create and amplify negative loopholes into your trading, which is basically what is causing those biases to severely impact your trading results. And what we're going to see moreover is that these biases tend to intensify over time. So if you don't identify the problem and work yourself around them, they really get worse and worse. So it is really an important part of trading, but definitely not the only one. Okay, so as usual, complex stuff down the road. So I'm going to use a PowerPoint support so that the visual stuff makes it easier for you guys to process the informations. All right, let's get it started. Okay, so in here you would see something that you should be familiar with already. This is kind of a chart we've already talked about. These two lines, I'm not sure the colors were the same, but they are basically your technical knowledge progression through time surrounding the different levels of maturity of the strategy. And the blue line would be the psychological management coming along with it. We've just added something in here, which is this a red line in here, which is basically highlighting how big and impactful the biases can be to your trading results. Which means basically when you were learning the basic third range boundary, range management stuff, the goal in here was not to teach you the most staggeringly complex technicals and stuff like that, but to start with something real easy so you can work around the most impactful stuff first. Because actually the uncertainty and impatience biases are just so big when we're talking about ranging context. So I'd rather like to put you into a context in which these biases will be heavily impactful, so you work around these first without exposing too much capital, of course. Remember that as you get to mature into a context, you need to go easy because those psychological biases can be impactful. Of course, these uncertainty and impatience biases you've worked around so far were very impactful. These are actually removing those biases is probably what turned your account from losing streak to normal, neutral, slightly positive streak. And now that you're getting to learn trend trading, and don't get me wrong, this one doesn't start at the beginning, because for the uncertainty and impatience biases, just the fact that you get into ranging context helps you getting around the bias all by itself. So the day one you start learning ranging context, you start progressing psychologically. It's not going to be the case for trend context. The trend bias and your progression, your psychological projection toward reducing this bias is going to come at the moment you will start practicing the trend trades into real market contexts. But most importantly, before doing such a thing, you need to master the technicals. Okay, it's really important. You need to make sure that on historical charts, you're fully able to identify intermediate trend maturities, that you'll be able to figure out the different trend structures on different asset classes, recognizing wave one extended and so on. All of these things must be mastered as you get to real exposition on the market. And just like you did for the previous biases, you're going to have to do it with very tiny position sizing at first to avoid heavy impact of the bias itself, because it will impact your results. It's basically not as staggeringly impactful as the first one were, but this guy will still have a negative impact on your returns, which means even if you master the technicals, the bias itself will reduce the expected returns of your account. Normally, not to a point that will switch your account to negative returns. You should still be positive even with the bias. But the problem is the one I stated earlier. If you don't fight against this bias, it amplifies over time, which means if you don't shift that curve, it can turn out to be as damaging as the first biases were. So that's also yet another reason why I got you starting with ranges first. So you first manage these guys out, so you focus on this one when you get to trend trade. All of the other guys who are getting into learning trend first, because that's what we want. We want to trend follow, dude. We don't care about ranges. Cool, man, but you are going to have to deal with all of these at once, because being inside trends certainly also comes with a lot of uncertainty and impatience biases, because trends have intermediate maturities, which are no more than ranges. So you will have to work yourself around uncertainty and impatience, as well as trend bias at once. And it's already hard enough to figure out trend biases. Why the fuck would you like to add an additional level of handicap to your trading? Okay, another stuff on this chart is to understand that the process to go from green to yellow is longer than it was for you at the beginning to get to the green level. So the psychological management is longer than it was for the first step. As a glimpse, I just gave you back then 3 to 6 months to work around your first biases. It takes 6 months to a year to work around your trend biases, also including 3 to 6 months of processing the trend information. They are far more context into the trend situation than they was in the range. Basically, the range is just the third range boundary. It has multiple options, trending ranges or neutral ranges, but basically this remains pretty much simpler than that. To the trending context, you'll get up to 6 possible contexts, and therefore it means you're going to have to process some more information. It takes longer to get there, and then, and only then, start working your psychology. All right, what we'll see later on is that the trend bias is coming from your educational system and your dominant position in society, and we will get to explain more about that and getting into more details into the next image out there. Okay, what's important in here is, once again, you need to master the trend technicals first and then get to real money, which will trigger the bias. Don't try to work in the biases before having the knowledge, because we need that knowledge to process and to filter out the trend bias actually. All right, so 6 to 12 months to get there, just like the beginner's biases. It is a cognitive process, which means it is subjective. It is not something you're going to be fully conscious, and it is basically something that ripples through time, and it's really important to understand that if you don't work around these biases, they amplify over time. So they might be, you might feel like they're not there, all right? I don't have this bias. Well, don't get me wrong. Everyone has a natural trend bias, and it has to be worked around. Otherwise, it amplifies over time to a point that it will not be eventually impactful in the first places, but it will turn out to be over time. And there is not just a capital risk that we're going to talk about, but I'll explain later about that. Okay. So what you need to understand with this is that the problem we're going to face in here is what psychologists are calling a cognitive dissonance, which is basically no more, no less than just yourself, okay, the value and the vision you have of the world, which comes from your identity, okay, which develops through time, and there is generally considered to be a switch over 4 years old in which your identity is supposed to be forged. And at that point, you are starting to create some deeper beliefs and values, which generally statistically amplify and solidify through the 4 year to 12, up to 12 years old, in which generally at 12 years old, your beliefs and values are supposed to be static, and you're just going to try gambling over these. Welcome teenage. So that's basically all about it, okay? So 3 months to 4 years is a first period of solidifying your static basis of identity, then developing beliefs and value and solidify these up to 12 years old. And then, of course, here comes the cognitive dissonance, because you're going to act and behave regarding those identity and beliefs and value coming along with them, which means what you do today is the result of what's been built into your first years of life, specifically your identity 3 months to 4 years, and the beliefs and values solidified throughout the ages later on, and of course shuffling the deck when you get to teenage. But these things are part of you, so the way you behave against the environment is defined by this identity that create a set of beliefs that created your values later on through time and impacted your behavior into a subconscious level. These are things you truly believe, these are your values, and they truly impact your behavior. The thing is that on real life conditions, when you behave, you impact your surrounding environment, okay? But into trading, it's not nearly going to be the case. The environment in here is your market. And how the fuck do you think you have any impact on the market? You do not. You have absolutely no impact, or very tiny little impact, so negligible that we're not even talking about it. So this is where the cognitive dissonance actually takes place. Because in the real life, behavior causes environmental changes, and there are some cognitive dissonances in the real life as well, when the returns you have for your environment basically don't fit your set of value and beliefs, okay? But in the markets, as you do not nearly impact the environment, if you trade according to your beliefs and values, which you will because it is a subconscious concept, it will impact your decision into trading, which means your trading behavior will be impacted by your beliefs and value that are underlined by your identity choices made below 4 years old. And this will cause cognitive dissonance with your behavior and the environment, which is the market. Okay? This is really important for you to understand that. What we're going to work around is this. The natural bias we've worked around, and we've talked about that, were actually forged below 3 months of existence, and this is the point in which basically you kind of solidified, unless major traumas down the road, your major stress response, fight, flight, or denial, okay? It is basically this, and it's going to be forged into your brain at these early stages of your life. And everyone has a fundamental response to this, but we all fight against uncertainty and impatience biases the same way. We use alerts for impatience, and we try to work around uncertainty by putting a set of rules between our feelings and our decisions. But for the trend bias, it's going to be a little bit more complicated, because of course we're all different, and we're all unique. Though it would be, what the fuck about identity? How do we define identity? As you are different than me, and we're all different than someone else. So we're going to have to make kind of an assumption in here that there is 3 major sets of identity, mostly coming from the way you've been educated and your dominant submissive first relationships in social behaviors. So your education below 4 years old is what's going to define 3 sets of identity directions that we're going to define 3 different ways to work around the cognitive dissonance. So that's what we're going to define into the next video, of course, but you need to understand that there will be 3 different ways to work around it. And of course, when we get to talk about the management biases, we're going to have much, much bigger problems to deal with, because we're going to have to deal with your beliefs and value and how they impact your hormonal system. But that's a topic for another day. And just to give it a glimpse, okay, we have 3 paths for identities, and we're going to have 9 paths to deal with to solidify the management biases later on and to work yourself around these. So much more complex stuff down the road. We're not yet there, don't worry. Today, 3 paths is going to be more than enough. All right, that's pretty much all about it. We need to talk about one final stuff, which is basically how do humans naturally respond to cognitive dissonance? Because of course, most of the time, the early response we've got to these, as they are psychological stress, considering it like friction. It is something that the body and the brain don't like. It's not cost efficient. It is really not good for your brain. So we'll have stupid response system for this. Early response, generally not the right ones, and we're going to have to work around these. So how do normal human beings work around cognitive dissonance? Because like we said, there's a cognitive dissonance with the market environment. There's a cognitive dissonance in real life, and you are experiencing these throughout times. So the first major type of solution that people bring out there is to seek for consonant elements. There is a dissonance, which is unpleasant, friction, it is not good. Well, let's try to fuck it all up by trying to reinforcing your own personal conviction, trying to justify your visions. The feedback you have for your environment, though for a case as the market, just basically says, it isn't working around my beliefs and values, something doesn't belong, something doesn't feel right, but, well, I'm right. As far as I check, I've got elements suggesting I am the one who's right. Second solution, reducing the dissonant elements itself, which is basically saying, well, the environment is wrong. I am right, my set of beliefs and values coming from my identity is the vision I have of world, and the world have to fit into my vision. Well, great, of course, but not real great when it comes to market environment, because fuck it, you have absolutely no action on the environment. You have to adapt, and suddenly not to make it fit your beliefs and value by saying they do bullshit, okay? And finally, the third option, which is a little bit smarter, of course, and that's the one we're going to try using to solidify the problem and work around the cognitive dissonance, is to try modifying the relative perceptions of cognitive consonants and dissonant elements, which is basically, we're going to try making sure that your set of beliefs are not totally infringed. So we're going to review a set of information using the hypothalamus and stuff like that. Not the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, and use memory. We're going to use strategical behaviors in here to make sure that you are not impacted by a bias that false your judgments and stuff like that. And we're going to amplify the perception and the reward system for you reviewing the strategy rules. Okay? That's the reason why you need to have those rules fully set it into your brains before trying to work around these things. And on the second stage, we're going to reduce the importance of dissonance element, figuring out that, once again, you've already made part of that job by working around the chaotic structures, by behaving in ranges. You need to understand that chaos is part of the thing, and the environment that you have in the market is going to cause those dissonance. Understanding what causes them will help you define that this is not your fault. Sure, it's not, but it's not either the fault of the market. So it reduces the amplitude of the dissonant elements. So reducing dissonant elements' importance and amplifying the positive things in which you seek for consonant elements by reviewing rules and strategy that cannot be biased. That's why indicators matter to me. Indicators don't lie. They tell something or they do not. They don't think. They don't have trend biases, okay? So that's really important for you to understand that. Anyway, so to finally understand how those two things, we need to work around 3 paths to find our solution. That's the topic for the video following this one. Let's move to another chart. So in here, we're going to talk about something really important, is the physiological stuff happening in the background. I could pass on this, of course, but this is, I think, the most rational and logical way to help you working around these biases, to let you understand what really is at play in the background. And as we did on the previous set of psychological videos, I've made a shitload of neurobiology to get you into understanding what happens into your cerebral cortex and into your early reptilian brain, cerebellum stuff, and what happens in between in this center of emotion, which is the limbic system, and what are the complex interactions that you can use to remap this into a more trading compatible situation to reduce stress feelings. Though it is not all about it, because some things can happen into your brain, but they definitely have rippling effects throughout the body, and specifically, and we've introduced that back then, through the pituitary gland, we're going to have a shitload of hormonal situations coming along with market exposition. And specifically about stress. Stress is not just into your brain, it also have real things to happen in your body. So, today we just dive into this, and just like I introduced you into the expert context psychological management, we're going to get much deeper into the hormonal system. Today we're just getting started with the major big guy of hormonal regulation, which is the HPA axis. H stands for hypothalamus, P for pituitary, and A for adrenal cortex, or adrenal gland generally. But the thing is that this axis, it's interesting because it has a feedback loop, and we're going to talk about it. So basically, the loop all by itself starts with the feeling of a stressful situation that requires, once again, psychological solution. The dissonance, the cognitive dissonance is a psychological stress. Therefore, we're going to need some things to help us solving the problems. That's why the hypothalamus will create corticotropin-releasing hormones and send it through the bloodstream. It is immediately directed to receptors into the pituitary gland, basically the CRH1 receptor, which are CRH receptor, to create and secrete ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. These hormones are specifically targeted for multiple stuff into the body, of course, but mostly the adrenal glands, in which we have ACTH receptor called the MC2R, and they are basically meant to receive ACTH and trigger glucocorticoids production. One of mostly known glucocorticoids is, of course, cortisol. There are many others, of course, and the adrenal gland doesn't only produce glucocorticoids, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, so what you need to understand is that to fulfill this feedback loop, you need to understand that back into the brain, okay, we will have glucocorticoid receptors. Basically, NR3C1 is one of these receptors coming from glucocorticoid and taking them to measure their abundance into the bloodstream. And they will be acting as receptor to negative feedback loop, the CRH production and ACTH. The feedback loop has two ways. It goes into the pituitary gland and into the hypothalamus, that or into the brain, that both have glucocorticoid receptors, which means basically when glucocorticoid circulates into the bloodstream, we've got those receptors there to capture these and saying, all right, we've got sufficient levels of cortisol, let's stop producing, or let's start dampening production, and therefore there is an inhibitory system by this negative feedback loop that is basically regulating the flow of cortisol into the brain and into the bloodstream, because of course too much cortisol will be damaging. So that is why evolution gave us that negative feedback loop that is going to inhibit CRH production and ACTH depending on the level of glucocorticoids reception. That's just as simple as it is. And that is a circle that creates the HPA axis. Hormones flow to the adrenal cortex to trigger cortisol production. Cortisol production is measured by glucocorticoid receptors, both into the pituitary gland and the brain. Okay? So that sounds easy. Well, great. Now what's the catch? Okay, the thing is that when it comes to trading, the cognitive dissonance is going to be hell of a long stress to figure out, because of course cognitive dissonance means you're going to have to work yourself out of these using the techniques we've just talked about. So either you're going to try gathering information to help you figuring out that you were right, or you're going to say they are wrong, but basically you're going to take some time to gather, process that information, and this requires energy. This energy is basically delivered by cortisol, because cortisol has many impacts into your body, one of the massively impactful one being regulation regulating the level of glucose into your body. And specifically, high levels of cortisol tend to create higher level of glucose into your bloodstream. Glucose is basically the first and most important fuel for your brain being the most consumption, the organ in your body consuming the most glucose. So producing cortisol is what we need. There is definitely a good stress. It is absolutely stupid to think about cortisol about something that isn't great, which most people actually think about it. If you think of it, if I tell you cortisol, you probably think, oh, stress, not good, whatever. There's definitely a good stress. When you need to solve a complex situation, you'd rather like to have cortisols into your bloodstream because that increases the availability for you to have sugar to feed your brain. Basically, that's what this is all about. But if you last too long, there is something negative that starts to show up. And that is basically it. Though I am trying to explain you as easy as possible what really is at play. It's of course much more complex than that, but it's kind of just a representation of it. The thing is that the negative feedback loop is going to be impacted when we trade and we trade trends, and when we have those recurring cognitive dissonance at play before we actually work ourselves around them. Is that the receptors we have in here have a sensitivity level that is certainly not a binary stuff like computer 1 to 0 stuff, okay? It's not like when we have sufficient level, we cut down production, end of story. And when the production is stopped, then we restore levels of sensitivity where they were. It's not how it works. The thing is that through time, okay, the receptors are going to reduce their sensitivity, which means the longer the stressful situation lasts, the higher the supposedly reasonable level of cortisols will be, which means the receptors, the dampening effects of CRH and ACTH production will dampen over time. The longer the stressful situation lasts, the more and the higher the level of acceptable cortisol will be into your bloodstream, because basically it figures out that the problem is more complex, though it needs more energy, so we're going to let more energy pass into the bloodstream. And then comes the point in which you solve the problem, because of course every problem has a solution, it's just a matter of time before you figure it out. The problem stands out here. When the problem is solution, you found a solution, the trigger level doesn't go right back to where it was before immediately. It would be better if we were just doing this, like rapidly the sensitivity level to trigger receptors dampening effect would return to the initial state. It's not. It's taking a far longer period of time to actually restore the previous levels, which is the catch. The thing is that if you last longer to solve the cognitive dissonance, but most importantly, if you go cognitive dissonance after cognitive dissonance after cognitive dissonance and so on, you have this, which means your sensitivity level just decrease over time as they do not have enough time to secure and go back to their initial state. You're piling on recurring chronic stress, and of course the longer you take to solve the problem, the deeper the dip actually turns out to be. And that is, the steeper the curve, the longer the problem to solve is. And of course, the more recurring the situation is, the faster, of course, this thing tends to deteriorate. So there are two factors, the duration to solve the problem and the recurring aspect of it. Okay? That is the problem, because this means basically the dampening effect of CRH and ACTH will be lowered over time, which means you will have levels of cortisol regularly, slowly but steadily, higher and higher and higher and higher and higher over time. So the point that it can turn out to be fairly dangerous, okay? So don't get me wrong out there. Cortisol is really good and we actually need it for multiple stuff into our body, and cortisol is not just stress related. That would be way too simple. Cortisol actually acts much more complicatedly into the body, okay? So the thing is that there is two things we need to work around. We need to work ASAP on the problems, okay? And we need to avoid the negative feedback loops to be altered by having constant chronic stress, because it will dampen over time your levels of a cortisol feedback loop and sensitivity, which will increase over time the cortisol level. Though the thing is that now that you have the HPA axis dysfunction system, let's try to put it into perspective. Normal stress response is basically when you have a normal physical mental stress. We're mostly having mental stress. Like we said, it's going to trigger HPA axis hormonal production, so we get cortisol release, and it has multiple impacts on our body, immune cells being one of so many others, cortisol receptors into the body. And one of the ones we care about is the level of glucose into the bloodstream, which will help us solve the problem by having energy available for our brain to work and process information. Totally good and normal stress response, the way things should be. Then comes the chronic stress and pathological response for it, which means, just like we said, we have increasing level of cortisol release because of chronic stress and the fact that our feedback loop doesn't work appropriately, which means we have an HPA axis dysfunction. But the thing is that it can go one step further. It can cause the fact that if the levels of cortisol are so long and so high, so durable and so high, that at some point it's going to cause brain damage, first of all, because too much sugar into the brain makes it inefficient for certain areas to work. And basically, oh god damn it, the areas we specifically need are the ones that are going to be the first damaged if we have too much sugar. Oh shit, Sherlock. So this is one of the feed negative loopholes that we can get. Too much cortisol is going to cause, of course, brain damage doesn't mean you're going to turn out to a dumbass. It's more likely that it reduces efficiency of mental processing, and specifically into the fucking frontal cortex, which we need the most. But it's not just about it. A recurring high level of cortisol into the bloodstream is going to cause cortisol resistance of cells into your body. And like I said, it's really, they're talking about immune cells in here, but oh man, it goes way beyond that. To sum it real simple, actually cortisol is one of the major elements that regulates the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. To put it real simple, the sympathetic nervous system is the one that is at play when you have physical response needed. Basically, when you're getting ready for sports, or you're going to have physical exercise, or whatever requires energy to be driven toward action is mostly called the sympathetic nervous system. And then you got the parasympathetic nervous system, which is more like, okay, we don't need to act right now. We're going to cool down. We're going to put on digesting system. We're going to work around immune system, and we're going to increase the level of glucose into the bloodstream, and we're going to do lots of things like that. Okay, it's more like a cool down effect around the opposite active effect, sympathetic nervous system versus parasympathetic. Cortisol, along with adrenaline, and adrenaline, by the way, is also secreted by the adrenal glands. They basically, so the adrenal glands' main function in the body is to regulate the oscillation between sympathetic and parasympathetic response. So, adrenal glands are freakingly fucking important, not just to solve a cognitive dissonance problem, they have a lot of impact into the way your body reacts. So, when you have cortisol resistance, what does that mean? That means your body is less predominantly going to switch from sensitive sympathetic nervous system to parasympathetic. And just like we said, it's going to take longer time for you to switch from one way to another, and that will have real life impacts. It is not nearly going to be a pathological thing, but it can turn out to be if it goes long enough. And remember what we said. The problem amplifies over time. So you need to work around the biases, because if you let them surround you over time, they create this first dangerous effect that can have real problems into your day-to-day life. You're going to have a shittier immune system, far longer response to switch from sympathetic to parasympathetic. But that's not all about it. Because in far extreme and longer prolonged stress cortisol response, you're going to have something much more complex that will actually happen. Because when your cells on the body will create cortisol resistance, they will need higher level of cortisol to trigger the switch between sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, that's the first step of the problem. The second step is, if there is so long over time production of high level of cortisol, actually you're going to start having adrenal fatigue. It's not just because of it, but it is going to cause the adrenal gland to start releasing lower levels of cortisol by basically dampening the ACTH receptors on the adrenal gland. There's going to be a dampening effect out there, which is going to cause the adrenal gland to require higher level of ACTH to trigger equivalent levels of cortisol, which will cause the cortisol level output to be dampened over time. And that is a problem, because when you have the conjunction of these two elements, first of all, cells that have a cortisol resistance, which means they need a higher level of cortisol to trigger switch, and on the opposite direction, you've got lower levels of cortisol released because of adrenaline fatigue and receptors dampening effect, you get something really, really, really fucking dangerous. Because at that point, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system oscillation is totally disconnected from the adrenal glands. And don't get me wrong, there are some other ways we can switch between sympathetic and parasympathetic, but the major pathway is through the adrenal gland secretions. And the fact that we need both adrenaline or epinephrine and norepinephrine facing cortisol and corticoids to basically switch this sympathetic to parasympathetic nervous system. And as we get to destroy that link, your body will be absolutely low, fatigued. It's going to be physical stress over time. You feel depressed, you feel weak, you have really immunodepression out there. Not to mention the mental depression is going to be chronic depression, heavily dangerous behavior out there. Don't get me wrong, it might sound unpleasant, but there are really quite some people into trading that go right down to these extreme levels, and there is no other way. And I'm going to go really, really extreme out there. If you are one of these guys that fears and suffer from chronic stress for so long that you are mentally chronically depressed and physically immunodepressed as well, God damn it, there's no other way but to stop trading. Trading is simply not going to be a good thing for you at the moment. You're eventually going to be able to get back to it sooner or later, but you need at least 6 to 12 months to get back on your feet. And that cannot be done with a trading activity aside. So you need to stop trading, be rational, do something for yourself. Stop that shit now. Go see a psychiatric on one end and an endocrinologist on another end, and you're going to need both of these guys to work yourself out of this problem first. And eventually later on, getting back to trading right at the beginning, start it all over again, okay? If you've gone too far already, there's no other way but to quit and get back in. Okay? It's absolutely necessary that you guys understand these things. Okay? Of course, not everyone goes right down to those extreme levels. Most of you guys will get into these two, and over time you'll get back to normal stress response, even if you had some kind of a path with chronic stress, because like, as we said, it takes from 6 months to a year to get over these things. So chronic stress to a tiny but still perceived pathological level is acceptable. It's part of your progress into trading, but normally over time you should get back to normal cortisol release, normal cell reactions and stuff like that, and you're going to restore the negative feedback loop on the HPA axis to normal level. Your body is meant to adapt, so of course it readapts if things goes back to normal. Okay, so that doesn't mean that if you got a little bit into this, you can't go back there. You definitely will get back there when things will be naturally handled. Okay, so durable exposition to trend bias can cause serious damage way beyond the capital loss, and the traders suffering from it must stop trading for a little while, restore the shit, and then eventually get back in here. All right, that was pretty unpleasant, of course, but I had to talk about it. Anyway, we've done everything we needed as a preparation for that. Next video is, of course, going to talk about how to positively and actively solve these issues. That being said, we've got more than enough, so we can go to conclusion. All right, so sorry for the unpleasant ending. Of course, we're going to get back to normal. Most of you guys will simply oscillate between the two. Certainly the middle one is unpleasant, but it's far from changing your entire life. Feeling a little bit depressed when you have natural trend biases, and we all have one, is absolutely normal. It's part of the job. It's going to be stressful, but you're going to learn to manage it. And the faster the better, of course. All right? the best solution is if you are following the coaching since the beginning, and the first time you get into trend trade is the time you start actively working around it, because 6 months is probably, yeah, just going to give you a little bit of chronic stress, but you'll rapidly work around it. The second factor we've talked about, and you're actively going to need to work around, is the leverage. Remember that leverage is definitely correlated to the impact of emotional stress and the importance of the cognitive dissonance. The cognitive dissonance will be there anyway. It's just that if you have cognitive dissonance with higher position sizing, the mental stress is going to be higher, the levels of cortisol will be higher, and so on. So you need to understand that, okay? Lowering the leverage is not just because I said so, it's really to avoid the negative impact it has on your cortisol level. There is definitely a clear evidence between the two. So low leverage is necessary, not because I want you to take less money from the market, but just I would like you guys to not suffer from chronic stress before you solve the trend biases all by themselves. Working around it isn't that complicated. It is a repetitive process that has to be mentally repeated until it actually turns out to be processed at a subconscious level, which means you'll still have the cognitive dissonance, but you're not even going to figure it out. It's not even going to stress you out, because you're basically going to immediately figure out that this is the thing you've done hundreds of times in the past. To a point, like I said, it's going to be actually neurologically subconscious level processed. And at that point, you've worked yourself around this bias. You will not have excessive level of cortisol production. And actually, like we said, the goal in here is not to destroy cortisol. Cortisol is really essential for your life. So don't cut on the bullshit I've seen out there in which people are trying to regulate cortisol level with pills and oh shit. The only way you can manage cortisol level is to actively think about solving the initial problem, which is the cognitive dissonance. And I'll give you the tricks to do it. Okay, so final stuff. Remember that there's going to be 3 pathways to get to this. So the next video will be split into 3 parts, and you can have a look at the whole thing, of course, if you're curious, but it's more important for you guys to figure out and work actively on your own personal identity level. And like we said, we're going to split it to 3. But okay, that's pretty much all about it. So here's a quick recap as usual. I hope you guys have understood quite some interesting things. I've been long with the process, so you guys understand everything that surrounds the iceberg below the surface level, and that's really what I think is going to help you solving the problem more efficiently. That being said, the most important one is the next video, so see you guys out there.